Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a life so magnificently disgusting, you'll wonder how anyone survived it, let alone lived it. Tonight's story is about what it was really like to be a medieval public toilet attendant. You know, the people that cleaned up your crap just so society could keep going. Because when your entire job involves sitting above a 5-foot pit of fermenting waste, the real question isn't if it'll explode, it's when. If you're enjoying our sleepy history journeys, I'd really appreciate a quick like or a subscribe. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing our sleepy community grow across the globe. Now close your eyes, lay back, because tonight, you're not just listening to history, you're living it. Here's the thing, when the average person in the Middle Ages sat down at a public latrine, they weren't just leaving behind the remnants of a hearty meal, they were also depositing centuries of culinary chaos, a gastronomic minefield of spoiled grains, pickled mystery meat, and bread so dense it might qualify as a building material. And you, ever the heroic attendant, get to witness the full digestive aftermath, one deposit at a time. Let's start with what they were eating. For most peasants, the diet was astonishingly beige. Bread was the centerpiece of nearly every meal, but not the soft, fluffy stuff you'd find in a modern bakery. We're talking about coarse loaves made with rye or barley, packed with bran, and sometimes baked with ashes or mashed peas to bulk it out. And if the grain happened to be contaminated with ergot, a fungus that thrived in damp storage, it could induce hallucinations, violent vomiting, or, more commonly for you, explosive trips to the bench with the best view of the river. Grains weren't the only culprit. Vegetables were seasonal, usually boiled into oblivion, and consumed in broth so thin they made water look like stew. Cabbage, leeks, onions and beans made frequent appearances, all of which were excellent for one thing: gas. A medieval latrine wasn't just smelly because of what went in, it was smelly because of what lingered, the aromatic ghosts of intestinal warfare. And then there was meat. If you were lucky, or suspiciously close to a pig's untimely demise, you might get a bit of bacon or salted beef. But preservation wasn't exactly science-based. Meat was dried, smoked, or soaked in vinegar and spices to mask the taste of decay. Spoiled food was not always thrown away. It was eaten with confidence and followed up by a loud, repentant sit-down at your latrine, which, as it turns out, is the unofficial gastroenterology wing of the entire village. The wealthy were even worse in their own way. Nobles had access to feasts filled with rich pastries, meat pies, exotic spices and wine, all consumed in obscene quantities and without the faintest knowledge of fibre. Constipation was practically a class marker, where peasants exploded, nobles imploded, and both groups waddled into your domain with equal desperation, equal discomfort, and equally shocking outcomes. Now let's talk texture, because yes, you eventually become an expert, a connoisseur even. You learn the consistency of someone who's been living on spoiled barley gruel versus someone who just returned from a celebratory eel banquet. You spot the panic sprints, those frantic arrivals to the bench that leave behind evidence of poor timing and worse judgment. You recognise the slow descents, the ones that whisper of mead benders and questionable poultry. It wasn't just gross, it was risky. For the latrine attendant, exposure to raw human waste meant daily encounters with the very worst medieval pathogens. Parasites were common. Flies buzzed from one deposit to the next like medieval postal workers, spreading disease with every dainty landing. Dysentery was rampant, and the latrines you managed could quickly become breeding grounds for the next village-wide illness, if not properly scraped, scooped, and occasionally set on fire. And yet, despite all of this, medieval understanding of digestion was rooted not in bacteria or enzymes, but in the four humours. According to this ancient theory, your health depended on the balance of black bile, yellow bile, phlegm and blood. If you were expelling too much of anything, well, clearly your humours were out of whack. Bad digestion wasn't a matter of spoiled meat, It was cosmic misalignment. A latrine emergency could be blamed on Saturn, or perhaps a malicious breeze. This is where your job becomes surprisingly medical. People might casually ask your opinion on what their output means. You weren't just a cleaner, you were an interpreter of stools, and there was historical precedent. Medieval texts like the Taquinum Sanitatis and other health manuals offered detailed guides on reading excrement for signs of internal imbalance, colour, texture, smell. All were believed to be diagnostic tools. You've seen them all. You could write your own diagnosis scroll and sell it under the name Your Old Gut Whisperer. And yes, occasionally someone would bring their own interpretation. A well-meaning soul might try to blame their particularly violent visit to the bench on an unlucky star alignment, or a suspiciously red-headed neighbour. Superstition blended with digestion in a way that only the Middle Ages could achieve, and somehow you had to nod, listen, and go back to brushing hardened cabbage shrapnel off the planks. The smells, of course, were legendary. A cocktail of fermented beans, sweat and ancient socks, layered with the unmistakable scent of fear. You learned to breathe through your mouth, or through a rag soaked in vinegar, a medieval trick to ward off the so-called miasmas that people believed caused disease. Spoiler, it didn't work, but it did add a tangy note to your suffering. And then there were the accidents. The unintentional trail left by someone who misjudged the sprint. The surprise splashdown that left someone's cloak permanently cursed. The explosive episodes that made the wooden bench warp in protest. You cleaned all of it. You scraped the hardened edges with a flat tool. You washed down the walls. Yes, the walls. Because some visitors apparently lacked aim, patience, or both. You replaced the straw. You patted down the moss. You did it all with the resigned air of someone who has stopped asking why and started asking how often. And in those quiet moments, late at night, when the lanterns are low and the river sighs beneath your feet, you marvel at what you've seen. The true story of medieval life isn't written in castles or tournaments. It's etched into the underside of latrine planks. It's smeared across stone walls and whispered in the midnight echoes of someone groaning over yesterday's goat stew. But tomorrow brings something new, because just when you think you've seen everything digestion has to offer, someone walks in with a bucket of spoiled oysters. So, the spoiled oysters have hit their target, and you're left standing in the aftermath of what can only be described as a gastronomic act of war. But now comes the real challenge. Because it's one thing to witness medieval digestive chaos. It's another thing entirely to clean it up without becoming a tragic footnote in someone else's bowel movement. Let's start with the tools. You don't have gloves. There is no mop, no disinfectant, no pressure washer, just a few wooden scrapers, a filthy bucket, some fraying rags, and maybe if you're lucky, a handful of vinegar that's been reused so many times it's now part vinegar, part sorrow. Cleaning a medieval toilet is an exercise in physical endurance and psychological detachment. You scrape, you scoop, and you try not to make eye contact with anything that moves. The surfaces are alive. The wooden benches absorb more than just weight. Over time, they become saturated with the remnants of thousands of visits, each layer adding to the ancient patina of human misery. You scrub them down using rough brushes made from bundled reeds or stiff bristles. If you're lucky enough to be near a river, you fetch water by the bucketful and splash it over the planks, hoping it dislodges something other than your will to live. Walls are another issue. There's always someone who misses. Maybe it's the dark, maybe it's haste, or maybe it's a kind of rebellious performance art. Either way, the stone or wattle walls surrounding the latrine become a gallery of medieval gut expression. Cleaning them involves rags soaked in old wine, or urine if wine is too expensive. Because yes, urine was considered a legitimate cleaning agent thanks to its ammonia content. So you spend your days surrounded by waste and your nights scrubbing it away with warm, fragrant pee. The air is thick, not just with smell, but with potential danger. Methane gas builds up in the pit below, especially in warmer months when decomposition kicks into high gear. One careless lantern can turn the entire structure into a medieval firework. There are recorded cases of latrines exploding, sometimes with unfortunate occupants still seated. You learn very quickly to open doors slowly, test the air carefully, and avoid open flames near suspicious bubbling. And then there's the wildlife. Rats are permanent residents. So are cockroaches, spiders, and occasionally snakes looking for a warm pit to curl up in. You swat, stomp, and sometimes strike deals with them out of mutual respect. The real terror comes in the form of worms and parasites because despite your best efforts, waste is never fully gone. You wear layers of rough wool to protect your skin, but the smell still clings, and it clings hard. Sometimes there's straw scattered on the floor to soak up the worst of it. That straw must be raked out and replaced regularly, assuming the town has not run out of money, or the peasants have not repurposed it for animal bedding. You try not to think about the loop this creates. A cow sleeps on the straw, a man eats the cow comes back out of the man, and you're there to scoop the reincarnation. When you clean the pit itself, the stakes are even higher. You lower yourself into the waste trench with a bucket and rope, or you lean over from above with a long-handled scoop. One slip and you're in. And not just in metaphorically, literally submerged. Gong farmers were notorious for falling into pits and never coming back out. The waste could be over 6 feet deep, and unlike the river, it didn't flow. It waited. It thickened. It pulled you in. Some towns employed pulley systems or carts to haul the waste out and dump it beyond the walls in designated dunghills. You guide the process, shovel by shovel, until the pit is clear enough to delay the inevitable return of chaos. But even after it's empty, the stench remains. The memory remains. You sleep next to it sometimes. If your job includes a shack attached to the latrine, you eat nearby, you dream of it. And yet, despite the filth, your work is surprisingly valued. Cities find people for improper dumping. Public defecation outside of latrines could result in punishment. Records from London, Paris and Florence show payments to toilet attendants, lists of duties, and even disputes over who cleaned which bench. Your work was seen as essential. Disgusting, but essential. Without you, the town would drown in itself. Occasionally you try to make it more bearable. You hang herbs to mask the smell, lavender, rosemary and mint if you can afford it. Most of the time it just makes the place smell like herbal failure, but it helps you cope. You whistle while you work, though the acoustics of a latrine amplify everything, and your songs tend to echo back with unsettling wetness. You hum instead. And just when you think you found a rhythm, something breaks. A floorboard cracks. A rat jumps out of a straw pile. A noble woman screams from the other side of the wall. You have to respond. You are the plumber, the janitor, the exterminator, and the emergency response unit for one of the most volatile systems in medieval life. A system that operates entirely on trust, gravity, and your ability to not vomit. You don't do it for glory, there is none. You do it because someone has to, and because in a society where people throw waste out of windows and pray it doesn't hit a bishop, your little wooden shack over a pit is the last defence against a full-blown public health crisis. So you tie your rag tighter, pick up your bucket and brace for the next wave. Because the only thing more dangerous than cleaning a medieval toilet is ignoring one. And as you lean over the edge of the trench just in time to hear something slosh beneath your feet, you realise what comes next. Not every visitor walks in with good intentions. Some carry more than waste. They carry curses. The bucket sloshes beneath your feet again. You don't flinch this time, but your shoulders tense just enough to betray the thought in your head. There's something about these latrines that always feel alive, even when no one's inside. Especially when no one's inside, the idea that something might be watching from the pit doesn't come from imagination. It comes from experience. Not yours necessarily, but the people who pass through. They come in mumbling prayers under their breath. They come in holding herbs. Some bring a companion to stand outside the door just in case. You've seen people strip naked before entering, convinced that loose clothing could trap a spirit. Others have dropped a coin in the hole before sitting, a payment to whatever lives below, hoping it'll take silver instead of something more personal. The fear isn't subtle. They believe the waste bit is cursed, not metaphorically, literally cursed. You've swept aside bundles of hair tied with flax string. You found dried toads sewn into cloth pouches and tucked behind beams. You've cleared bowls of salt arranged in circles around the entrance, all of it left by people terrified of the same thing, that something in this place might follow them home. The latrine is a sacred threat. It sits at the crossroads of filth and fear. Its pit opens into the unknown. For centuries, people have believed that unclean places invite unclean spirits, and there is no place more unclean than this. The damp, the dark, the decay. It fits every medieval description of a demon's preferred environment. And when someone falls ill after a visit, no one blames the spoiled stew or the contaminated water. They blame the bench. You've heard them whisper about it. A latrine that steals warmth from the air. A foul presence that climbs up your spine when you're most vulnerable. One man claimed the smell followed him for days, even after bathing in wine. Another insisted he saw a pair of eyes beneath the hole staring back through the rising steam. They weren't joking. They weren't drunk. They were afraid. Monks once wrote about demons that lived in sewers, feasting on human shame. They described spirits that clung to walls and breathed through the cracks between boards. In one scriptorium, a marginal note warned readers never to sit with both feet off the ground, lest something reach up and take hold. These weren't fairy tales. They were footnotes in daily life. You felt it too. The sudden drop in temperature when no wind is blowing. The way sound shifts when the pit is full. There's a heaviness to the air that vinegar-soaked rags can't explain. The straw rustles when no one moves. You've worked in silence and heard footsteps behind you, only to find the doorway empty. You don't ask questions. You start sweeping faster. No one teaches you how to ward off curses. You learn through necessity. You start carrying iron nails in your pockets. You hang sprigs of rosemary over the door even if they wilt in days. You avoid speaking aloud while cleaning. Words carry weight in places like this, and silence feels safer than being heard. People begin asking you about the bench. They want to know which hole was used by the woman who died last week. They ask if anyone sat on the left side of the beam in the past month. One man brought a priest with him, refusing to enter until the wood was sprinkled with holy water. Another claimed the straw had been hexed and demanded it be burned. You did it. The smell was worse than usual that night. Every few months someone etches a symbol into the wall, a simple cross, a geometric knot, a pair of concentric circles with lines cutting through them like blades. No one admits to drawing them, but they appear overnight. You rub them out when you find them. You stopped asking why after the third one started to flake in your hand, leaving black dust on your fingers that smelled like burnt teeth. You've seen people leave offerings, small coins, pieces of bread, a silver ring wrapped in fabric. You don't touch them. When they disappear, you pretend not to notice. Once, you found a note written on parchment tucked beneath the edge of the floorboard. You didn't open it. You slid it back in place and added a pinch of salt nearby. The straw around that section turned black within days. None of this makes your job harder in the usual sense. The waste still piles up. The flies still gather. The scraping, the scrubbing, the endless cycle of rotten rinse. It continues, but the space shifts. It breathes differently. Some benches feel colder than others, even when the sun is out. The wood warps in strange places, not from moisture, but from pressure that doesn't seem to come from weight. You once stepped into the pit at sunrise to check the water line. The stench barely registered compared to the sensation of being watched from underneath. The surface rippled, not from movement, but from stillness too perfect to be natural. You climbed out slowly and didn't speak for the rest of the day. People expect you to know what's safe. You've become a kind of interpreter. They describe their symptoms and ask if the latrine is to blame. Rashes, nightmares, fevers. One woman lost her voice after a visit and blamed the whispering she heard while seated. Another man claimed to have coughed up a nail. You don't argue. You just start wearing more iron. The town healer told you once that demons don't live in waste. They live in fear. That they grow stronger in places where people feel most ashamed. It made sense. No one enters a latrine proudly. No one exits bragging. The place itself becomes a collection point for every whispered sin, every suppressed thought, every unspoken regret. If something does live down there, it's been well fed. There's a crack in one of the back walls now. It wasn't there last week. Inside it, just barely visible in the candlelight, are lines carved too deep to be accidental. You rub them once, then again. The grain of the wood doesn't match the direction of the marks. And when you press your ear to the surface, you don't hear water. You hear breathing. You replace the straw, mop the floor, and leave a pinch of salt in each corner. The door creaks shut behind you. Tomorrow you'll come back with sage. You'll burn it slow and let the smoke settle. And if the breathing returns, you'll ignore it. Because the latrine might be cursed, but it still needs cleaning. The salt settles in the corners, the door creaks shut, and you try not to look back at the crack in the wall. You know better. You've seen things shift that shouldn't shift. But you also know that what's waiting for you tomorrow isn't a ghost, it's gravity. Because curses and demons might get all the medieval headlines, but for someone in your position, the real danger is structural. Every time you step inside that public latrine, you're playing a game with physics, and medieval physics has no mercy. These aren't stone buildings with careful reinforcements and blueprints. These are shacks, planks nailed over pits, roofs lashed together with rope and hope. The average public latrine in a medieval town is a precarious little cube balanced over a hole full of human regret. The wood sags, the beams creak, and every year the pit below grows deeper and more aggressive. You walk across the floor like you're crossing a frozen lake in spring, one groan away from legacy. The weight of the bench alone is enough to cause problems, but it's not the wood that threatens you. It's the people. Medieval towns did not have a department of waste engineering. They had peasants, gravity, and guesswork. You've watched crowds pile into the latrine during festival days, one after another, until the platform buckles like a drunk donkey. They never notice. You do. You've patched floors with barrel lids. You've reinforced beams with ropes scavenged from broken carts. One time you stuffed straw into the gaps just to keep the wind from whistling directly up someone's tunic. It worked, but the rats didn't appreciate the redecorating. They started biting ankles. Collapse isn't hypothetical. It's history. There's a recorded incident from Erfurt, Germany, in 1184, when a gathering of nobles fell into the latrine beneath the monastery hall. The floor gave way mid-ceremony. Dozens of lords plunged into the muck and drowned. Royal robes, ceremonial swords, and all. That wasn't some freak accident. That was medieval architecture on a normal day. You've seen early signs of this kind of collapse. The subtle give of a board under your foot. The strange shift in airflow that means the pit has opened wider. You've learnt to trust your knees. If they tense before your brain does, it's already too late. And then there's the methane. The slow, silent threat that rises from the waste pit like a curse with no superstition attached. It builds over time, trapped under layers of fermenting matter. If someone brings in a lantern without your approval, you stop them. If they argue, you quote the story of the priest who lit a candle in the privy and was found the next morning halfway through the roof, charred from the knees down. Explosions happen. They're not common, but they're possible. The gas has nowhere to go. It builds in silence, waiting for fire or friction. Sometimes you think you hear it bubbling, like soup that no one asked for. And when the bubbles rise too fast, you get out. You pretend you're fetching straw. You let someone else sit first. You've developed a survival instinct based entirely on auditory compost. Your job includes checking for leaks, not the gentle drip of water. Number. These are the leaks that mean the pit has eroded its way into the soil and might soon collapse into someone's root cellar. You once found a cabbage patch growing on waste runoff. It was the healthiest produce in town. You never told anyone. When it rains, everything gets worse. The latrine tilts. Water pours through the cracks. The pit threatens to flood. Sometimes it does. You've had to evacuate benches mid-squat. You've had to haul out the straw, drain the trenches, and shovel sludge uphill with nothing but a warped board and a rope that smells like despair. You tried adding a drainage pipe once. The pipe clogged within a week. You tried using wider slats. Someone fell through. You tried spreading ashes to absorb the moisture. The ashes clumped and formed something resembling medieval concrete. You spent 3 days breaking it apart with a flat stone. In winter, the bench freezes. The wood becomes slick. People slide. One man left the latrine with splinters in places that cannot be politely described. You sanded the surface after that, but the grit wore down the straw padding faster than usual. You tried fur once. The fur absorbed too much. No one has forgiven you for that. Frost cracks the boards. Mold swells in the corners. You line the walls with rags to trap the heat. You sleep beside a furnace that barely works, just to keep the pit from freezing solid. A frozen pit doesn't stop the flow, it redirects it. You've seen waste build into stalagmites. You've had to break them with a hammer. You don't want to know what it sounds like when frozen excrement shatters. But you do. You remember. The animals don't help. Pigs love the latrine for reasons no one fully understands. They break in at night, rooting through the straw for scraps. You've chased them out with torches. You've installed barriers. One pig learned how to lift the latch with its snout. You started sleeping with a stick across the door. Snakes come for the warmth. Rats come for the straw. Birds come for the insects. You once found a ferret curled up on the bench. It refused to move. You named it something unprintable and let it stay. It scared off the pigeons. You've been asked to reinforce the roof. You've laughed. There is no money for that. There is only rope, mud, and leftover timbers from the bakery fire. You patch what you can, pray it holds, and carry a satchel of tools with you everywhere. Not for repairs, for escape. There's a ladder in the corner. You placed it there 2 years ago, quietly, without permission. It leads through a loose board in the ceiling. No one knows it's there but you. It's your emergency exit. Because if the pit erupts, or the floor drops, or the beams snap, you don't want to go down with it. You've worked too long to be remembered as the one who drowned in other people's problems. Each morning you stomp the boards before entering, not out of superstition, but to test the flex. You listen for that one note of weakness that says not today. If it groans in the wrong pitch, you fetch a bucket instead. You wait. You let the structure think it's won. Then you reinforce it while it sleeps. This place may be cursed, but cursed structures still rot, and curses don't hold up roofs. You do. The wind picks up outside. Something creaks. You glance up and see a spider swinging from a beam that wasn't there yesterday. You tighten the straps on your boots and begin inspecting the supports, because the last thing you need is someone important deciding to visit. Nobles have higher expectations, and they weigh more. The spider drops from the beam. You let it fall. There are worse things in this room than a spider. Nobles, for example. You hear the announcement before you see them. A servant hurrying ahead, clearing their throat, knocking on the door like it's a chapel. Nobles never come alone. They travel in packs like heavily perfumed wolves, trailing lace, silks, and unreasonable expectations. One of them is about to sit on your bench, and you're expected to make this experience feel like a royal procession through a scented meadow. You adjust the straw, you double fold the rag, you check the vinegar basin to make sure it's only mildly offensive instead of openly aggressive. Nobles do not tolerate discomfort. They consider toilets beneath them, literally and figuratively. They arrive with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, powdered wigs perched high enough to graze the rafters, and an expression of betrayal that suggests they were promised gold-plated facilities, and you are the personal failure responsible for this wooden disaster. They glance around as if the air itself has wronged them. The floor creaks and they step back like they've encountered a puddle of shame. Their attendants hold the door open, but never enter. No one wants to be too close when the silk hits the straw. You stand nearby, pretending to be invisible. Nobles don't speak to you unless something is wrong, which means they always speak to you. The seat is cold. The smell is medieval. There are flies. Why are there flies? Are these standard flies, or has someone hexed the room? What is this draught? Why is the river visible through the cracks? Are you aware that their cousin once had a latrine built entirely from marble? You nod, make sympathetic noises, and try not to visibly brace for the structural stress of 15 pounds of satin collapsing onto old pine. The real danger isn't their weight, it's their diet. Nobles eat like the apocalypse is scheduled for dessert. Eels baked into pies, boar soaked in ale, custards, creams, syrups and spices by the handful. No fibre, no moderation, just meat, wine and ambition. Their digestion is unpredictable. It arrives late and exits loudly. You've heard the noises, you've seen the aftermath. There are moments when you honestly believe their intestines are staging a rebellion. And when the rebellion succeeds, it's your problem. They don't wipe, they don't scrub, they leave and expect someone else to fix it. You do. You always do. You mop up fermented regret, replace the straw, and hope the wood holds. You've had to remove things that do not belong in a digestive system. Jewellery, buttons, an entire plum. Once, a wooden token from a tavern on the other side of town. You still don't know how that got there. The smells linger differently. Noble waste doesn't rot the same way. It curdles. It feels like a challenge, like it's daring you to identify it. You've tried sprinkling herbs. They wither instantly. You've lit incense. It gives up halfway through the room. You once hung a satchel of dried rose petals and came back to find it soaked through and humming. They ask about the bench. Is it clean? Is it dry? Has anyone used it recently? You lie. Of course not. You cleaned it just for them. You aired it out. You spoke kindly to the wood. You polished the hinges and told the flies to take a break. They nod like they believe you. You both know they don't. And if they stay too long, their servants start to panic. Nobles do not like being alone, even in the toilet, especially in the toilet. You've had to knock gently and pretend to be checking the door. You've had to hum so they know you're still nearby. You've stood outside while an entire entourage whispered anxiously about the state of their master's bowels. Some nobles bring their own staff. A valet with a silk towel. A lady's maid with a perfume spritzer. You've watched them form a human wall around the door, guarding against invisible intrusions while someone inside battles with an overstuffed digestive tract. You've seen a bishop escorted to the bench by 4 monks and a goat. You didn't ask. They don't want to touch anything. You've had to lift their cloaks out of the way. You've had to adjust cushions. You've been asked to hold a mirror while someone reapplied makeup mid-defecation. You did it. You held the mirror. You stared at your own eyes and wondered if it was too late to become a monk. When they're done, they pretend it never happened. They leave without a word. The entourage reassembles. Perfume is sprayed. Coins are sometimes left, but never enough. You count the silver and realise you've just been paid 1/3 of a loaf for an experience that will haunt your dreams for weeks. And nobles are never punctual. They visit without warning, sometimes at night, sometimes during storms, once during a fire. You opened the door to shout a warning and found them seated calmly reading a scroll while the roof burned behind them. They waved you away, The scroll was important. When they don't come, they send messengers. You've received handwritten complaints about the ambience, the lack of seating variety, the smell of the floor, the disrespectful angle of the moonlight. One note was sealed with wax and smelled faintly of apricots. You burned it. You tried to upgrade the space once, hung a tapestry, brought in a chair, planted herbs outside. A noble sat down, looked around, and said it reminded them of a barn. You removed the upgrades, you stopped trying. Now you wait, you prepare, you check the beams, you fluff the straw, you light the least offensive candle and brace for another visit from someone who expects to be pampered while their body panics. And when they leave, you clean. You clean like your life depends on it. Because in a way, it does. Nobles remember bad toilets. They talk about them at feasts. They turn complaints into poetry. You once heard a bard recite a sonnet about a splinter in a duke's rear. It ended with your name. There's a knock at the door again. A servant steps in, sniffing the air. Another visit. Another performance. You straighten your back, force a smile, and gesture toward the bench like it's a throne. Because today your toilet isn't just a latrine, it's a stage, and the show must go on. The bell rings in the town square. You know what that means. You've counted down the days with the same dread that farmers feel before a plague of locusts. It's festival day. The saints are being honoured, the ale is flowing, the pies are questionable, and every stomach within a 10-mile radius is preparing to test your engineering. People always assume the market stalls are the busiest part of a celebration. They are wrong. It's the latrine. It's always the latrine. Crowds drink faster, they eat more, they dance, shout, run, and laugh. And then suddenly they're clutching their bellies with the look of someone who just remembered the fish pie came from a cart with no wheels and one suspiciously blind vendor. By mid-morning, they're lining up at your door. You open the latch, you check the beams, you brace the frame. Your floor has never been more threatened. You hear creaking in places that didn't exist yesterday. You spread extra straw across the boards, not because it will help, but because it gives you the illusion that you're in control. You're not. They arrive in waves. First, the cautious drinkers and the early bread eaters. Their visits are polite, routine, manageable. But soon, the ale takes hold. The greasy lamb legs hit the lower gut. The musicians are playing faster. The meat has been sitting in the sun since dawn. And suddenly, your latrine becomes the epicenter of bodily collapse. You see it in their eyes. Panic, determination, betrayal. They knock without knocking. They beg. They sweat. One man screams through the door and then sprints into the alley behind you. You don't follow. That's someone else's jurisdiction now. Inside, the smell multiplies. It changes shape. It develops layers. You learn to identify meals based on the stench. The garlic stew is back. The honeyed tripe is making another appearance. You hear sounds that should not come from humans. You hear silence that means something has gone very, very wrong. You start rationing the straw. You run out of vinegar. You wave rags like a flag of surrender. No one notices. They're too busy groaning. One woman insists on blessing the bench before she sits. A man insists the pit is watching him. Another throws up before he even reaches the seat. You clean it all. Children arrive in clusters. They use the place like a game. They poke at things with sticks. They drop apples into the hole and cheer when they disappear. One climbs into the pit ladder. You stop him before he becomes an archaeological discovery. A group of monks arrives with solemn faces and a clear need for haste. They chant softly while seated. You pretend not to hear. The chanting rises. Something splashes. You sprinkle salt in the corner. By noon, the floor is slick. You lay down boards for traction. A man slips anyway. He leaves behind a trail of regret and a feathered hat. You hang the hat outside as a warning. The benches begin to shift under the pressure. The wood groans like an old sailor. You reinforce the edges with rope and prayer. You station yourself by the wall to control the flow. You direct traffic. One in, one out. A drunk merchant tries to bribe you to cut the line. He offers you a fish. You decline. You're now part of the town's infrastructure. People consult you before entering. They ask about the state of the seat. They ask if the river has backed up. They ask if you've seen their cousin. You have not. You offer them a twig with mint leaves anyway. It helps no one. A trumpet sounds outside. A noble is being paraded through town on horseback. You peek through a crack and realise he's sweating profusely. You recognise the signs. He dismounts suddenly. His eyes lock on yours. The crowd parts. The bench braces. You light a candle and whisper an apology to the wood. He leaves quickly. He leaves something behind. You do not describe it. You simply toss the rag out the window and pretend it never happened. A dog carries it away. You wish the dog well. By mid-afternoon, the heat makes everything worse. The stench rises like a summoned entity. People start complaining. You point to the incense. They say it smells like failure. You agree. Someone tries to play music near the latrine to lift spirits. The tune turns sour after the third verse. The musician begins gagging and runs. You nod. The instrument remains. It becomes a coat rack. A man brings in a pig. He insists it's for emotional support. You disagree. The pig stares into the pit. The pig refuses to leave. The pig becomes a fixture. Children begin daring each other to look down the hole. One screams and faints. You tell the others this is what happens to those who seek forbidden knowledge. They scatter. You notice a leak forming near the corner. The wood is warping. The weight has finally begun to turn the latrine into a wooden swamp. You do what you can. You pack mud into the crack. You wedge a board into the frame. You try not to think about the story of Erfurt. Someone lights a pipe inside. You slap it out of their hand with a reflex you didn't know you had. They apologise. You consider charging a fee for every act of survival you perform today. Evening approaches. The line thins. The food stalls close. The ale runs dry. People begin shuffling home with less pride than they arrived with. You watch them go, each one lighter than before. The bench breathes again. The walls creak in relief. You step inside and survey the wreckage. The straw is soaked. The vinegar is gone. The bucket is full. The pig is asleep. You sit on a clean spot and exhale. Then you hear a familiar sound. Another trumpet. Another noble. You don't move. You close your eyes. You count to 10. It does not help. Because festival day never truly ends. It lingers. It seeps into the wood. It leaves behind stains that even you can't scrub out, and tomorrow it's market day. The sun barely rises before you hear the first clatter of carts. Market day. It's not as loud as a festival, but it's more dangerous in its own way. Quieter, sneakier, less explosive, more constant. Like a leak in a roof you'll never quite fix. And it always starts the same way, with a smell of roasted onions drifting through the cracks, and someone knocking on your door while chewing. Traders begin their day early. They drink while unloading goods, chew dried meats with one hand while haggling with the other, and by mid-morning come to you in a slow but steady trickle. It doesn't seem like much at first. A few groans, a few rushed footsteps, but by noon it becomes clear that the cured pork was undercured and the ale was overserved. They don't line up like festival goers. They loiter, linger, lurk. They pretend they don't need to go until they suddenly very much do. And unlike the nobles, they don't complain about the smell. They complain about the fees. You have no official fees, of course, but you've learned to improvise. The town might not pay you much, but a few pennies here and there, a loaf of bread, a chunk of cheese, it adds up, especially when the merchants are desperate and trying to unload inventory without unloading their dignity on the street. You stand by the door like a doorman at the gates of intestinal salvation. They approach with nervous energy, coin already in hand. One gives you a dried fig. Another offers a goose feather. You accept both. You do not ask what they plan to use as toilet paper. Inside, it's the usual scene. The straw shifts, the air thickens, the bench creaks with the tension of too many bad decisions wrapped in pastry. You hear things you didn't think human bodies could produce. One man enters silent and leaves apologising to the wall. You pat him on the back and hand him a clove. Some come in pairs, watching each other's carts. One keeps lookout while the other battles their personal demons. They switch without speaking. This is the rhythm of the market. Silent cooperation born from mutual digestive suffering. You've seen merchants argue over who gets to go next. You've seen bribes. You've seen theft. You once caught a man trying to install a second bench using stolen wood so he could charge others and cut you out of your own latrine. You broke it with a stick and gave him a splintered souvenir. He left in shame. You still have the sign he painted, Express Privy, no waiting. There's an economy here, a hidden system of exchange built entirely on the urgency of bowels. You've received fish, fabric, salt, and once a live chicken in exchange for quick access. You resold the chicken to the man behind him. Everyone was happy except the chicken. The worst offenders are the bakers. Their ovens run hot. Their hands are covered in flour. They think heat makes them immune. It does not. One baker once asked to use the bench while still carrying a tray of rolls. You told him to leave the bread outside. He didn't. He returned with fewer rolls than he entered with. You never asked where they went. Spices are a special kind of danger. Pepper merchants carry tiny sacks of combustion. They spill it. They inhale it. They eat too much of their own product and end up sprinting to your door like cannonballs. One sneezed mid-squat and left scorch marks on the straw. You now keep a wet cloth nearby, just in case. There's a balance you have to maintain. Too much cleaning and the smell stirs. Too little and it settles into something permanent. You've learned to sweep between waves, to dump vinegar at intervals, to swap out the straw before it becomes moss, to open the hatch below and stir the pit when it clogs, which it always does after 3 spice vendors and a roasted lamb. You do repairs between sessions. The hinges are loose, the roof leaks. Someone tried to scratch their name into the wall with a bone. You sand it down and reinforce the seat with 2 boards scavenged from a broken fruit crate. You're not proud, but it holds. The rats return. The flies never left. You shoo them with a bundle of mint and a tone of voice that suggests mutual disappointment. You lay out more herbs. Someone mistakes them for garnish and eats them. You hear him retching an hour later behind the fish stall. By late afternoon, the smells outside begin to match the ones inside. The street gutters overflow, buckets slosh. Someone tips a chamber pot into a puddle and laughs. The laughter stops when a passerby slips and curses 3 generations of their family. You watch from the doorway, sipping weak ale and pretending to care. Someone brings you a gift, a leather apron, stiff, cracked, but better than nothing. You wear it proudly until you realise it has a hole right in the middle. You patch it with rags. It still smells better than your tunic. The wine merchants are the final wave. They come late. They come loud. They do not knock. They sing. They stagger. One insists the latrine is a magical portal. He tries to commune with the pit. You let him. You watch. He cries. You sweep again. You light the candle. You replace the herbs. You stare into the pit and wonder how many voices it has collected today. You've started hearing echoes. Maybe it's the merchant shouting. Maybe it's the pit answering back. A boy walks up holding a tray of candied dates. He asks if he can use the corner to rest for a minute. You point to the bench. He shakes his head. Just needs a moment. You nod. He sits. 10 seconds later, he runs. You shake your head. Dates always do this. The sun begins to set. The carts roll away. The stalls close. The fish is packed up. The meat is salted. The last loaf of bread is sold to a woman who hasn't blinked in an hour. You sweep one last time and bolt the door. Tomorrow will bring new traders, new smells, new noises. You hang the gifted apron by the door and sit on your stool, listening to the gentle drip of a long day ending. And then you hear a knock, not frantic, not angry, just slow, heavy, rhythmic. It's the blacksmith. You get up slowly because this one's going to be loud. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. You know that rhythm. You've come to recognize it the same way sailors recognize incoming storms by the pressure in their knees. The blacksmith is here. You open the door and brace for the breeze. He fills the doorway like a wardrobe with lungs, eyes already scanning for structural weakness. There's soot on his cheeks, singe marks on his sleeves, and a faint heat coming off him that makes the straw wilt a little. He doesn't say anything. He never does. He just nods and steps inside like he owns the building. He doesn't. But your floorboards fear him enough to give him a pass. He grunts as he sits. The bench lets out a noise you've never heard it make before. You whisper something encouraging to it and back slowly away. You know better than to be nearby during a blacksmith's visit. The man eats iron for breakfast and washes it down with raw cabbage. His stomach operates under a different physics entirely. When it speaks, people within a 3-house radius hear it. You learned early in your career that every trade has a digestive signature. Bakers ferment, butchers stew, scribes bind themselves in cheese and wine until they forget how chairs work. But blacksmiths ignite. Their meals are pure fuel. Roasted meats, stewed beans, blackened root vegetables, and tankards of thick ale that could power a siege engine. You suspect their intestines contain bellows. He stays in there longer than usual. You hear shifting, you hear breathing, you hear a single clink which you do not investigate. You've learned not to question the contents of a smith's apron. Once he brought in a horseshoe and left it behind. You nailed it above the door for luck. The flies avoid that corner now. There's a pressure shift. You feel it in your chest. The sound that follows is not loud so much as atmospheric. It changes the temperature of the room. It peels the paint from the inside of your skull. You stand very still and thank every deity you've ever half believed in that you reinforced the bench last week. And then, silence. He exits without comment. He drops a silver coin into your palm the way one might tip a bard who's just performed a deeply moving funeral dirge. You nod respectfully. He disappears into the street, steam rising faintly from his shoulders. You walk back inside and close the door behind you. The air has changed, not worse, just different, charged. You light a fresh candle and open the hatch to air out the pit. A pigeon that had taken up residence under the eaves chooses this exact moment to evacuate the building. You consider following it. It takes time to recover from a blacksmith's visit. You scrub harder. You check for scorch marks. You toss the straw and lay down fresh pine shavings. You burn sage, rosemary, and whatever else you have left in the emergency sachet. One time, after a particularly powerful visit, you hung garlic and a bell above the bench. It didn't help, but it made you feel like you were trying. You wonder sometimes how he survives. What kind of intestinal lining does it take to endure that kind of meal and still shoe a horse afterward? You suspect it's part of the trade. Blacksmiths build armour, forge blades, and apparently develop bowels capable of surviving a direct hit from a boiling stew pot. You've seen less trauma on battlefields, but he's not the only one from the trades who leaves an impression. The tanners are worse in smell. The millers leave a fine dust behind that clings to everything like guilt. The brewers, though, are close rivals in force. They arrive in groups, loud and burping, and leave behind puddles that fizz, but none compare in sheer gravitas to the blacksmith. His visits are legend. His presence is myth. You once caught 2 children standing outside the latrine after he'd left, daring each other to go inside and breathe like the Anvil Man. You stopped them. They weren't ready. What people forget is that his visits are predictable. Every 3rd day. Just after midday, he eats on schedule. He digests like a clock powered by volcanic activity. You've learned to prep beforehand. You lay extra boards. You check for leaks. You tighten ropes and shift buckets into easy reach. If this job has taught you anything, it's that survival is a matter of preparation and well-timed retreat. There's a ledger you keep hidden behind the door, not official, just notes, patterns, observations. You log every visitor, not by name, by sound, smell, vibration. The blacksmith has his own section. Symbols only. You stopped using words after the third entry. Words aren't strong enough. Once, during a town meeting, someone suggested replacing the latrine with a newer model. Brick, maybe. A nicer bench. Better airflow. The suggestion died instantly. Everyone glanced toward the forge. No one spoke. You all remembered what happened last spring when he tried using the latrine at the alehouse and cracked the seat in half. You repaired it. You still have splinters from that day. Your structure may be held together by rotten twine, but it's the only place in town that knows how to survive him. You've trained it. You've tuned it like an instrument that only plays one note, fear, and it plays it beautifully. You sweep once more. You sprinkle some ash. You tighten the nails in the wall just in case. The floor groans under your weight, not in protest, in anticipation. The next visit is in 2 days. You have time. Until then, there are other trades to deal with, and tomorrow brings the potter, which ironically is somehow worse. The bench still groans when you press it, but the floor holds. You reinforce it anyway. 2 more planks, a handful of nails, a string of muttered encouragements whispered to the support beams. You glance at the door. No knock yet, but today is Potter's Day, and that's its own kind of disaster. You wouldn't think clay would be your enemy, but it is. Fired, glazed, beautifully painted, then dropped on the ground during a midnight emergency. Broken pottery is the great equalizer. Rich or poor, if your chamber pot cracks at the wrong angle, you'll come sprinting down the alley with a story you don't want to tell and a dripping sock you refuse to acknowledge. Potters never clean up their mess. They just make the mess holders, and if they mess that up, it becomes your problem. The worst ones are the cheap pots, thin clay, weak firing, no reinforcement at the base. They're fine if you're storing grain. They're less fine if you're storing last night's pickled eel stew. One bump, one slip, one panicked shuffle through a dark cottage, and it's on the floor. Or worse, on someone else's. And by morning, it's dripping through floorboards into the neighbour's bread box. That's when you get the knock. They arrive clutching towels, rags, newspaper if they're fancy. Their expression is always the same, part guilt, part desperation, all fear. They need the latrine, but they also need answers. What potters are reliable? Where can they buy one that won't betray them during a storm? Has anyone invented something with a lid? You shake your head. You direct them to the bench. They ask you questions you're not qualified to answer. How do glazes work? Is that lead? Does it explain the ringing in their ears? You nod. You guess. You add a line in your mental ledger that says, possibly poisoned by cobalt. You've written that 5 times this week. Medieval pottery wasn't designed with sanitation in mind. The insides were rarely glazed. The rims were rough. The shapes were optimistic. Some had handles, some didn't. Some tilted when placed on flat ground. A few were entirely round on the bottom and required a stand, which no one ever had when it mattered. You've seen them roll across cobblestones like little bombs, and the noise. Nothing wakes a medieval street quite like the sound of a full chamber pot shattering at 3 a.m. You've heard it from 2 blocks away. The scream that follows is always the same, a mixture of surprise, horror, and regret. By dawn, the word spreads. Someone's pot cracked. Someone's luck broke with it. Everyone else tightens their grip on their own and checks for hairline fractures. You clean up after it every time. The alley beside the latrine becomes the drop-off zone. People show up with cracked pots and half-formed excuses. One man tried to pass his off as accidental soup. You didn't ask. You just pointed to the pile of broken pottery in the corner where failed ceramics go to die. You once tried keeping a list of reputable potters. It lasted 2 days. Everyone has a story. This one's pot leaked. That one's shattered in the cold. One woman swore hers screamed before it broke. You stopped recommending anyone. You started carrying a patch kit instead. Wax, string, bits of leather to create emergency seals. You handed out 2 last week. Neither returned. The chamber pot industry is built on false hope. People want elegance. They want painted rims and swan-shaped handles. They forget it's a bowl for bodily despair. You've seen pots that cost more than a month's rent, decorated with tiny saints, as if divine imagery will make the contents less offensive. It doesn't. In fact, you've found it makes the guilt worse. They look at the angels on the rim and apologise. You hear them from outside. And then there's the matter of disposal. Not everyone uses the latrine. Some just toss the contents into the street from a second-floor window, shouting, "Gardy-loo," if they're feeling generous. If not, the cobbler's apprentice gets a surprise on his morning route. You've watched full households empty their pots out of habit, rain or shine, citizen or priest below. You've mopped up more than your share. The smell hits first, but the sound, that heavy splat on stone, is something you feel in your molars. People ask why you don't offer more chamber pots in the latrine. The answer is simple. They disappear. Within days they'd be taken, cracked, misused or used for soup, and you can't afford to replace them. You made one once from wood. It absorbed everything. The experiment ended in tears and a small fire. Even when people do bring their pots to the latrine, they leave them. Forget them. Hide them. One woman buried hers in the straw and denied ever owning it. You found it the next day, still half full. You gave it a funeral. Then there are the potters themselves. They show up now and then, smug as pigeons, eager to sell new models. They pitch innovations like double-fired for strength and dribble-free rims. You smile, nod, and ask if they've ever used one. They never have. They just make them. You offer to let them try the latrine. They decline. You understand. Some do care. A few potters have started experimenting with wider bases, lids, even handles that don't snap when gripped in a panic. You encourage them. You offer feedback. You once wrote a list of improvements and handed it to an apprentice. He read it, nodded, and promptly tripped over the doorframe. The pot he was holding cracked in half. You both stared at it in silence. The truth is, chamber pots aren't going anywhere. Until someone invents indoor plumbing, people will keep trusting ceramic bowls to hold their worst moments, and those bowls will keep failing them. So you mop, you sweep, you stack the broken ones neatly in the alley, where they glint in the sun like warning beacons. You keep a spare bench ready, and you never ever trust a pot that looks too pretty to be functional. A knock at the door, sharp, impatient. You glance outside and spot a familiar face, the town's travelling physician. He's holding a large jar with something floating inside. You sigh. Because now it's time to deal with the people who think bodily waste is a roadmap to the soul. You open the door and immediately regret it. The town physician stands there smiling in that peculiar way that only people holding jars of warm liquid ever smile. He lifts the jar like it's a prize. You try not to look at what's floating inside. It winks at you. Probably a trick of the light. Probably. He steps past you without asking. They always do. Physicians do not knock. They arrive like comets trailing the scent of rosemary, leather gloves, and quiet arrogance. You close the door behind him and begin mentally preparing the bench for a lecture on phlegm ratios. The physician sets the jar on a flat stone beside the latrine and begins unpacking scrolls, charts, a candle, a second jar. He has brought his own bench. You sigh and move yours aside. He doesn't trust your wood. He prefers his own. Birch, carved with stars. You once asked what the stars meant. He said digestion is ruled by Venus. You don't ask questions anymore. This is not your first encounter with urine-based prophecy. You've watched him hold a chamber pot up to the sunlight and squint as if it contains the secrets of the cosmos. He dips a feather in it. He swirls it like soup. Sometimes he sniffs it and nods slowly, like he's remembering a childhood memory he never had. He believes in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. These are the rulers of the human body, and every expulsion is a clue. The stool tells him what the soul is doing. The urine tells him who's winning the war inside your veins. You've seen him peer into a bowl and whisper the words red, frothy, choleric, then prescribe boiled nettles and fasting beneath a waxing moon. You once watched him diagnose a man with excess melancholy because his urine was cloudy and smelled like boiled cabbage. The man had eaten nothing but cabbage for 3 days. This did not come up. He spreads out the urine wheel now, a real one. Vellum stretched on wood, faded ink, 32 shades of yellow arranged in a perfect circle. You've seen it many times. Pale straw, deep gold, cloudy with a red ring, bubbles near the top. Each colour corresponds to a humour. Each smell implies an imbalance. Each result ends in the same prescription: purgatives, bloodletting, pray more, drink less, unless your humours say the opposite. He invites you to look. You decline. You pretend to be busy with the broom. He asks for your opinion anyway. You glance. It's orange, not just yellow with flair, actual orange, like sunset through dirty glass. You raise an eyebrow. He nods and mutters something about spleens. What you do not say is that you've seen this colour before, every spring. When people start eating early berries and washing it down with muddy water from the thawed stream, you know what happens next. A week of regret, a visit to the latrine, a strong smell of fermented root and lies, but to him it means something sacred. He writes it down in his little book. He asks if you've noticed any changes in the smell of the pit. You say it smells like despair. He laughs. He thinks you're joking. You are not. He retrieves a pouch from his cloak and sprinkles dried herbs into the jar. It fizzles. He looks delighted. You look concerned. He tells you this is how the spirit reveals its turbulence. You tell him it looks like soup. He does not laugh. He examines the bubbles. He taps the side of the jar. He tilts it toward the candle and hums. Then he declares the patient will be dead within a fortnight. You ask who the patient is. He shrugs. Found it outside the baker's shop, unlabeled. You begin sweeping harder. This is not rare. Medieval medicine loves mystery. It thrives on symbolism. The human body is a cathedral filled with misbehaving monks. If your bowels scream, it is not because you ate bad cheese. It is because your inner fire has been smothered by excess cold humours. If your urine is dark, it is not dehydration. It is your liver expressing sadness. You've heard him give the same advice to different people for entirely different ailments. Eat less garlic. Bathe only on Thursdays. Avoid looking directly at millstones. The sick nod and leave. You see them again the next day, carrying buckets and shame. Once he brought a scroll detailing a treatment involving dandelion root, wine-soaked linen, and a single duck feather. You asked what the duck was for. He said companionship. You decided to clean the floor instead of continuing the conversation. But not all physicians are fools. Some genuinely try. They wash their hands, which is rare. They examine patients with care, ask real questions, measure pulses. They still use leeches, but at least they count them before and after. You respect those ones. You let them sit without judging the noise they make. You even offer extra straw. The problem is that most people think waste is mystical. They want answers in the shape of their stool. They bring you samples. They ask your opinion. They hold up chamber pots like trophies and demand your insight. You are not a doctor. You're a janitor of the human condition. But they trust you more than they trust anyone else. You have seen things. That counts for something. You once told a man his stool was a bad omen because it floated. He swore off eels for a month. He brought you a pie as thanks. It tasted like regret. Another time, a woman asked you to compare the smell of her output to that of her neighbour. You declined. She returned the next day and asked again. You declined harder. She left crying. You felt bad for 1 second. Then you stepped in something soft and changed your mind. Back in the latrine, the physician packs up his tools. He leaves the jar. He always does. He calls it an offering to science. You call it Tuesday. You pour it into the pit and scrub the stone. You burn a little sage, not because it works, because it helps you believe the bench might survive another day. Outside, the wind shifts. You smell something different, not worse, just unusual. You open the door and see a young scribe approaching with a stack of parchment and an awkward limp. You know that limp. You know what's coming, because no one sits that long writing by candlelight without consequences. You step aside as the scribe enters, clutching his parchment like a shield and moving with a kind of slow, deliberate urgency only possible after 2 weeks of boiled lentils and exactly 0 walking. He doesn't speak. He nods. You nod back. Words are unnecessary. The bench understands. So do you. Scribes are their own species. Pale, hunched, and permanently ink-smeared. They live in scriptoriums where the only furniture is benches and regrets. Their diet consists of whatever's soft, beige, and capable of being eaten with one hand while the other is trapped in marginalia. Cheese, bread, brother. Maybe a prune if they remember what fruit is, and water sometimes. But only if the ink hasn't claimed the pitcher first. You've cleaned up after many scribes. You've begun to notice patterns. Theirs is not a story of urgency. It's a saga of resistance. They arrive not with explosions, but with endurance. You can smell the effort before they even sit down. You can hear it in their joints. The long, slow descent to the bench. The quiet moment of reflection. Then the hope. Then the betrayal. You offer no commentary. You fetch a bucket. You light a candle. You prepare the vinegar just in case. They never ask for privacy. Scribes are used to company. They work shoulder to shoulder for hours in silence, sitting on wooden stools with no cushions, no breaks, no room to squirm. Their posture becomes permanent. Their intestines adapt by giving up. You once had to help a monk off the bench after his knees locked mid-process. He thanked you with a copy of a psalm. You used it to patch a leak in the roof. The real tragedy is they often believe the problem is spiritual. That discomfort is divine discipline. That pain is part of the calling. One scribe told you his blockage was a punishment for leaving a comma out of a biblical translation. You offered him a bowl of soaked oats and a warm place to sit. He cried. They write about everything, except this. No scribe has ever detailed the true story of what happens when you live on curds and self-denial. You've seen it. You've cleaned it. You've burned the straw after. There's a Latin manuscript that supposedly outlines the ideal bowel movement. Scribes used it to compare their own experiences. You've seen it. The phrases are poetic. Gentle descent. No straining. Aroma of health. You laugh every time you read it. The reality is far less elegant. More splintered bench than scented scroll. You once caught a group of scribes comparing stools like scholars, discussing texture, colour, frequency. One insisted his lack of movement was due to divine restraint. Another claimed to have passed something shaped like a bishop's hat. You brought them a diagram of the latrine's load-bearing capacity and asked them to please stay under the limit. They applauded. Their robes do not help. Long, layered, always in the way. The number of times you found fragments of hem trailing through puddles of failure is too high to count. You installed a hook for cloaks. They ignored it. You placed a stool for folding. They used it to rest their elbows. One even brought a writing board into the latrine and began sketching during the wait. You had to take it away after the ink bottle tipped and rolled directly into the pit. They thank you with parchment. Always parchment. Scraps, fragments, illuminated bits with strange doodles in the corners. You've got a stack of them now. You tried to trade them for vinegar once. The merchant laughed, then stopped laughing when he read one. It was a marginal curse involving onions. You got your vinegar. Constipation in the medieval world isn't just a nuisance, it's an identity. You've overheard confessions where men blame their sins on stomach pressure. You've seen herbalists prescribe foxglove and tree bark. You've heard people suggest jumping from a low wall to dislodge the blockage. You've tried not to imagine the consequences. The problem is posture. Scribes sit wrong, all day. No movement, no walking, just bent spines and clenched innards. The human body was not made to spend 12 hours hunched over the life of St. Jerome, but here they are, bent, bloated and whispering prayers to saints who probably didn't have this problem. There's one scribe who visits weekly. You've nicknamed him the Pusher. He hums a tune while working, a slow, deliberate melody you've come to associate with deep internal negotiation. He always brings his own rag. He always leaves it behind. You've stopped asking why. Today's scribe finally finishes. He exits with the same pained dignity he entered with. He does not speak. He leaves a folded scrap of parchment with a drawing of the latrine. It is labelled with phrases like blessed threshold and seat of reflection. You tuck it behind a loose board where you keep the other artistic tributes. You check the bench, minimal damage, some scratching, possibly from fingernails. The candle is still burning. You relight it out of habit. Scribes come and go, but the ink stains stay. You wipe the seat, sprinkle some herbs, and refill the vinegar basin. Outside, the wind shifts again. You hear boots, heavy, purposeful, sharp. You know that walk. It's the town watch, which means someone has done something illegal, and the evidence is almost always in your pit. You don't even need to look to know it's them. The boots always give it away. Thick soles, iron buckles, the rhythmic stomp of someone who has a badge, a baton, and no intention of cleaning anything ever. The town watch doesn't visit for pleasantries. They visit when something has gone missing, and somehow that something has almost always found its way into your pit. The door creaks. You're already standing beside the bench, broom in hand, trying to look more innocent than a person surrounded by drying vinegar and human leftovers should reasonably look. The guard doesn't speak. He just nods toward the hatch. It's always the hatch. You lift it slowly. The air changes, thicker, older, still bubbling from the last visit. You hear it gurgle, like it knows it's about to be accused again. You glance at the guard. He steps back. Of course he does. Because in this town, the latrine is more than a place of relief. It's where evidence goes to disappear. You've pulled many things from that pit, most unintentional. A sandal, a necklace, a wooden flute, a terrifying doll head. But some items are deliberate, tucked inside a cloth, wrapped in string, weighted with a rock. People don't toss that much effort into losing their keys. The guard hands you a hook. You lean in with practiced reluctance. The pole is long, the hook is bent, the job is unpleasant. You've done this too many times to count. You fish gently, like a man hoping the trout is already dead. The pole catches something, a bundle, software wrapped. You lift it slowly. The guard steps back again. You lay the object on the stone floor and slice it open with a shard of pot. Inside is fabric. Money. A small leather pouch sealed tight. You don't ask questions. You don't want answers. He nods, takes the pouch and leaves. No thanks, no coin. Just the scent of mystery and the sound of boots vanishing into the street. This isn't new. People have been using latrines to hide things since the first time someone realised that no one wants to dig through a pile of fermented failure unless legally required to. You found letters, bottles, a dagger with a name etched into the handle. a bag of apples covered in wax. You told yourself they were medicinal. You told yourself a lot of things that day. Latrines are the final vault. Once something enters, it's usually gone forever. But when the law comes knocking, you become the unwilling locksmith. You've heard whispers of entire trials turning on what was found beneath the bench. A missing ring, a stolen coin, a cursed charm wrapped in wool and buried below the splash line. And it's not just the guards. Neighbours show up too. That merchant's wife, always watching from her window, claims someone cursed her onions and threw the proof into your pit. You asked what the proof was. She said you'd know it when you smelled it. You did not search for it. A priest once asked you to inspect the pit for signs of heresy. You told him heresy usually floats. He left in silence. Kids try to be clever. They steal something and panic. They sprint to the latrine and drop it in like a hot coal. You hear the splash, followed by guilt. They hover at the door, eyes wide, waiting for divine punishment. You tell them it's already happened. You make them sweep. They never come back. Some hide secrets. Others hide sins. You once pulled up a bundle that contained a wooden figurine of a bishop, several dead mice, and a note that read, "Forgive me." You did not. Crimes aren't always big. Sometimes it's a loaf of stolen bread. Sometimes it's a borrowed tool that snapped in half and got tossed out of panic. But the latrine doesn't care. It receives all offerings equally. Nobility, shame, criminal intent. All sinks the same. You've been paid to retrieve items. You've been begged to forget others. You've developed a face for both. Neutral, slightly bored, just attentive enough to keep them talking while you prepare the vinegar. The worst is when someone denies it. They point to the pit, swear they've never touched it, and then casually describe its contents in suspicious detail. You nod. You make a note. You add a splash of lie to the edges, just in case. You've learned to recognize the signs. The nervous shuffle, the quick glance toward the bench, the way someone lingers just long enough to suggest they're waiting for something to dissolve. You give them a smile that says nothing ever does. And it's not just theft, it's gossip, betrayal, evidence, letters not meant to be read, tokens of forbidden love. You once found a locket inside a shoe inside a bag of flour. That story has no good explanation. The pit has become a record of the town's conscience, not its history books, not its scribes, just you and your hook and the things people pray will never resurface. You're both custodian and unwilling witness, a keeper of secrets marinated in cabbage and regret. You once tried to burn something retrieved from the pit. It screamed, not audibly, but chemically. You never burned anything again. Instead, you bury them, deep, away from the bench, beneath the compost heap or inside the abandoned shed behind the latrine. The pile grows. You tell yourself it's just trash. You know better. The guards return a week later, this time with 2 more boots and a list of names. They're looking for something valuable. Gold, maybe. Jewels. A scroll sealed with wax. You tell them they'll need gloves. They laugh. Then they look into the hatch and stop laughing. You hand them the pole. They leave 10 minutes later, empty-handed, pale. One of them vomits behind the bakery. You close the hatch and light the candle again. A merchant passes by, clutching a basket of dates and walking faster than usual. You note the colour of his cloak. You note the way he avoids eye contact. You wait until he turns the corner, then you step outside and check the straw behind the latrine. It's still warm. You sigh, pick up the broom, and wonder what crime has just been committed. Because around here, the truth always ends up the same way. Deep, smelly, and handled by you. You brush the straw aside and pretend not to notice the footprints. The pattern is familiar. Light step, hesitation, then a quick pivot toward the bench. Not urgent, not criminal, just nervous. You've seen this before. It's the posture of someone hoping to use the latrine for a reason entirely unrelated to digestion. It's matchmaking season again. The town is buzzing with pairings, arrangements, suspiciously timed gift baskets, and accidental strolls past the bread stall. Young people are eyeing each other through lace-curtained windows and behind stacks of firewood. And for reasons no one can quite explain, your latrine has become part of the ritual. It's not the smell, it's not the privacy, it's the walls, thick enough to muffle voices, thin enough to hear murmurs. The latrine is where secrets are whispered, and confessions echo back just loud enough to be misinterpreted. They call it the booth, a small side bench you installed to replace a broken crate. It's just outside the main latrine, behind a thin divider and a hanging curtain. Technically not part of the structure. Functionally a front row seat to medieval awkwardness. Couples meet here in secret, or near couples, or people hoping to become couples. They pretend to need the bench, but stay longer than necessary. They pretend not to notice when the other one walks in a minute later and sits just close enough for a whisper. You hear everything, you're not trying to. But when one person's trying to declare affection while pretending they're actually here for digestive relief, it tends to get loud and complicated. Once, a boy recited a poem through the wall. It started with metaphors about flowers and ended with something about bubbling streams. The girl laughed so hard she accidentally knocked over the vinegar bucket. You spent the next hour pretending you weren't crying from the smell. Another time, a woman tried to leave a gift basket behind the bench for her admirer. The basket contained apples, herbs, and a sprig of heather wrapped in ribbon. It was immediately stolen by a goat. The goat remains a romantic legend in your records. The problem is that no one admits they're doing it. They all claim coincidence, that they just happened to be near the latrine, that they were passing through, that they definitely weren't waiting for anyone, they just really liked the smell of damp wood and pickled cabbage. You've seen full-fledged courtships unfold here. Exchanges of ribbon, past notes, a shared mug of weak ale. You've watched awkward first meetings where both parties sat on separate benches, staring at the floor and hoping the other one would mention the weather, or at least burp in a way that sounded like affection. The latrine serves as neutral ground. No one can accuse you of chasing someone if you're just heading to the toilet. No one can accuse you of spying if you happen to be cleaning the walls. The space is deniable, private, sacred in its weirdness, and yet there's danger. One misstep and the romance turns to embarrassment. You once saw a suitor trip over the slop bucket while trying to deliver a compliment. The bucket spilled. The compliment was never finished. The relationship ended before it began. There's also the matter of overhearing. Nothing spreads faster in a medieval town than a misunderstood whisper from behind a toilet wall. You've heard people declare their love for someone they didn't realise was already seated. You've watched two separate couples show up at the same time, only to discover they were both dating the same man. He exited through the roof hatch. The guards sometimes patrol the area, not for crimes but to eavesdrop. You caught one transcribing love notes once, hoping to blackmail a merchant's daughter. You confiscated the scroll and used it as emergency patching for a leak. You felt no guilt. You've tried to create boundaries. You posted a sign, no loitering. It was stolen and used in a love poem. You installed a rope to divide the space. Someone turned it into a belt. You stopped trying. The real tragedy is that most of these couples end up fighting, not loudly, just quietly. One person stops showing up. The other lingers longer and longer. Eventually they stop visiting. Then someone else starts. The cycle continues. You've considered writing it all down. A full log of latrine love stories. But you know better. Romance this fragile doesn't survive documentation. And besides, no one wants to read about the time their great-grandparents met in a room that smells like boiled shame and damp vinegar. Still you watch. You listen. You light the candle. You arrange the straw. You pretend not to notice the tiny initials carved into the side of the bench, surrounded by a lopsided heart and a splash that definitely wasn't paint. It's a strange place for love, but then again, So is most of medieval life. Outside, the clouds are shifting. A storm is rolling in. You smell it in the wind, rain, mud, and trouble. You check the roof for leaks. You brace the hatch. Because nothing tests the limits of medieval architecture like a night of heavy rain. And nothing floods faster than the town's favourite toilet. The clouds gather faster than you hoped. The smell shifts before the wind does. Damp wood, damp straw, damp everything. You glance up at the sky and count 3 distinct shades of grey, all moving toward each other like enemies converging on a battlefield made of regret and fermented barley. You tighten the ropes on the hatch. You wedge a broken crate under the leaking beam. You press your hand to the floorboards and feel a faint vibration that has nothing to do with footsteps. The rain begins, first as a tap, then a patter, then a roar. There's no warning system in place for what comes next. No official protocol. No scrolls from the city council with step-by-step instructions. You've had to invent your own emergency plan over the years. Step 1 is stay calm. Step 2 is forget step 1. Because a medieval latrine is not built for weather. Some are over pits, some are over rivers. Yours is built over both, which means when the water rises, so does everything else. The river swells, the ground softens, the pit below begins to gurgle like a stomach deciding whether to forgive or erupt. You've tried waterproofing, clay, pitch, wax. None of it holds. The rain finds its way through every seam, every crack, every regretful repair job you've ever done in a hurry. You once spent an entire day sealing gaps with crushed moss. It dried into a kind of sponge and made everything worse. The first sign of real trouble is the floorboards lifting. Not dramatically, just enough to tell you that whatever lives beneath them is stretching. The waste expands, the gases swell, the pressure rises. You feel it in the soles of your boots. People still try to use the bench. They arrive soaked, clothes clinging, shivering, insisting it's an emergency. You let them in. You warn them not to flush anything that doesn't already float. They don't laugh. The smell intensifies. Rainwater hitting the waste pit stirs up everything you'd rather keep settled. It bubbles. It seeps. It develops an atmosphere. You once described it to a visiting herbalist as old soup boiling in a boot. He fainted. You set up sandbags. They're not sand, just sacks filled with sawdust and lies. You place them around the door, around the hatch, anywhere that might offer a few minutes of delay. Delay is the only strategy you have. Because eventually it floods. It always floods. The rain pours into the river backs into the pit climbs into the floor. You watch it rise like bread dough, slow and relentless. You tap the boards and listen for the difference in tone. Hollow becomes heavy. Dry becomes doomed. You've developed tools for this. A scoop. A siphon made from a bent horn and a long prayer. You used to try and drain it. Now you just try to keep it from reaching the bench. The townspeople pretend they don't know what's happening. They walk faster past your door. They suddenly remember they have chamber pots. The brave few arrive in cloaks, holding lanterns and hope, and leave immediately once the smell hits their teeth. You once saw a noble arrive on horseback during a storm. He refused to dismount, demanded service. You handed him a bucket and pointed to the alley. He never returned. His horse did. The worst part is the creatures. Rats float, spiders climb, worms arrive from beneath, confused and aggressive. You've had to chase them off the bench mid-flood with a broom, yelling curses invented on the spot. One time, a frog took up residence in the bucket. You named him Bishop. He outlasted the storm and 4 tenants. You keep a ledger of storms, not for scientific reasons, for psychological ones. It helps to see the list. Helps to know which storms broke the roof, which ones collapsed the eastern wall, which one flushed an entire bench downriver and into a bakery's basement. There are rumours of latrines that collapsed entirely during storms, dropping the user straight into the pit and sealing the exit. You believe them. You've seen the splinters. You've seen the fear in people's eyes when they ask, very softly, if the bench is secured to the frame. You say yes, you don't say how. You've tried building a gutter, the gutter filled with straw and redirected the flood into your sleeping mat. You burned it. You sleep upright now. You once built a second roof out of thatched baskets. It lasted one afternoon. The wind shredded it and sent the pieces into the river, where a goose swallowed one and developed a limp. You started using oilcloth. It works until it cracks. Then it drips. Then it peels. Then it mocks you. The current storm reaches its peak by nightfall. The latrine is holding barely. You light a candle and place it in the corner furthest from the rising sludge. The flame flickers low. The smell is unbearable. The bench looks at you with the kind of exhaustion that usually belongs to veterans and midwives. Then the rain stops, not slowly, all at once. You listen for dripping. There's none. Just silence. Then frogs. Then the faint sound of something heavy shifting inside the walls. You open the hatch and look inside. The level has stabilized. The waterline is high but retreating. You watch as the contents of the pit slowly settle back into place like a crowd, finding its seats after a riot. You sit on the dry edge of the threshold, breathe through your sleeve, and wait. Eventually someone will knock. They always do. You'll let them in, point to the straw and warn them to tread lightly. They'll nod, step inside and marvel at the fact that the bench still stands. They'll ask how you kept it from collapsing. You'll shrug and say the same thing you always do. Weight distribution and blind faith. The rain dries, the smell settles, and the sun returns with vengeance. Most townsfolk move on. They hang their laundry, sweep their doorsteps, and pretend nothing happened. But in the latrine, the aftermath lingers in ways they'll never understand. Because while medieval people feared demons, curses, and foul winds, the real danger was smaller, much smaller. Too small to see, but you see the results every day. The post-flood heat activates a second wave of problems, the kind that doesn't come crashing in with thunder, but creeps up the walls when no one's watching. Moldavian mites, fungus, larvae, invisible microbes, and entire ecosystems living comfortably inside the grain of the wood. This is where medieval sanitation reaches its most ironic point. The toilet exists to remove waste from daily life, but without knowledge of bacteria or proper cleaning agents, it ends up creating more health risks than it solves. You can wipe the bench, rinse the floor, replace the straw, but the spores are already in the air, in the damp wood, in the cracks between the stones. Heat and humidity turn your carefully maintained space into an incubator. Black mold develops first. It starts as harmless-looking dust. Then it spreads, sticky, velvety, patchy across the corners of the room. You've seen it curl straw like dried parchment. It climbs the beams. It settles in the thatching. Medieval people don't understand what it is, but they recognize its effects. Headaches, breathing problems, coughing fits that linger for weeks. You've watched people emerge from the latrine looking paler than when they entered. There's no real cure, no bleach, no industrial scrub. You scrape it off with a flat blade and hope it doesn't come back tomorrow. It always does. Next to the mites, tiny, white, almost invisible. They arrive silently, feeding on damp wood, straw, cloth, and occasionally flesh. You feel them first. That itchy spot on your ankle, the sensation of movement beneath your tunic. You lift a cushion and see the swarm. You throw it in the river. Then the flies return. House flies, dung flies, flesh flies. You've come to recognize them all. They breed in the pit, lay eggs on the walls. Their larvae writhe in the straw like something that escaped a bad dream. You've installed mesh screens, herbs, vinegar traps. Nothing works. They dodge every defense like they've trained for it. Medieval fly theory isn't helpful. Some people think flies are punishment for sin. Others think they come from spontaneous generation, appearing whenever rot is nearby. No one blames the pit. They blame the moon. Or the baker. You continue swatting. You've watched maggots devour an entire loaf of bread in under a day. You've seen them squirm from a crack in the bench, triggered by heat alone. You've scooped out piles of them, shoveled them into buckets, dumped them outside and watched birds refuse to eat them. The fleas are worse. They don't arrive alone. They travel on rats, and the rats are always nearby. You've plugged holes, set traps, laid stones. Still, they find a way in. You hear them scratching at night. You smell their nests. You find their droppings in the corner beside your tools. Rats bring lice bring more fleas, and fleas bring plague. You've read the stories. You've heard the warnings. Buboes, fever, blackened fingertips, towns wiped out in weeks. People say it came from ships, from merchants, from strangers. But you know it also comes from here, from the spaces people don't clean, from the corners they pretend don't exist. Urine splashes across stone and never dries. Feces gets trapped in cracked wood. Mites feed on the oils in your rag. The straw breaks down into compost and hosts eggs for every biting thing that has ever dreamed of warm flesh. There's a theory going around about miasma, that bad smells cause disease, and while the science is off, the conclusion is surprisingly close. Because where there's rot, there's risk, not from the smell itself, from what lives in it. The pit below you isn't just a container, it's an environment. A thriving colony of microbial life. Anaerobic bacteria that digest waste without oxygen. Methanogens that create the gas you light candles to avoid. Sulfate-reducing bacteria that give the pit its distinct aroma of warm coins and despair. You've stirred that pit. You've watched bubbles rise like curses. You've accidentally splashed your boots and burned them that same night. You don't take risks anymore. You wear high shoes. You coat the soles with wax. You tuck your trousers into your socks and hope no one notices. Your immune system is legendary now. You've survived more exposure than most physicians see in a lifetime. But even you have your limits. There are days your hands itch, days your eyes sting. You once coughed for a week and blamed the mould. You still do. There are treatments. Vinegar is common, so is ash. You've used powdered charcoal mixed with sage. It musks the smell. Sometimes it slows the growth, but it never stops. You've considered fire. Total cleansing. One spark and the problem ends. But so does your job, and possibly the bakery next door. So you clean, you sweep, you scrape. You light herbs and hope they smother the spores before they reach the thatching. You hang lavender and rosemary, not because they work, but because they remind people of something other than rot. The town still uses the latrine, every day, as if nothing lives inside it, as if your hands are not permanently stained with whatever lives in the straw. You've learned to nod, to smile, to open the door with calm precision while holding your breath. Because summer is long, the pit is deeper than it looks, and the real danger isn't what goes in, it's what comes back out. The pit may have cooled, the flies may have thinned, but the stink never really leaves. You know it, they know it, and the smell knows it. No matter how clean your hands, how tightly you tie your cloak, or how many herbs you tuck behind your ears, your reputation clings to you like a damp rag that once had a purpose, and now just hangs there reminding everyone what you do. You are the public toilet attendant, and that means no one truly knows what to do with you. In medieval society, status runs on perception. There are knights who smell like barn animals but are considered noble. Merchants with fish guts on their shoes who sit at the front of the guild table. But you deal with something far worse, something no one wants to admit exists. You clean it, you touch it, you talk about it with confidence, and for that you are respected and feared. At the market, people step aside when you approach. Not rudely, not with malice, just gently, almost unconsciously. They smile too widely, they nod too fast. They hold their breath and hope you don't stand still long enough to be part of their afternoon. You've noticed the pattern. You greet the baker, and he suddenly remembers an urgent need in the back. You wave to the scribe, and she drops a parchment and pretends it's a delivery. The apothecary offers you vinegar at a discount, but always in double-wrapped bottles. You accept it all with grace. No one wants to touch you. Not your hand, not your sleeve, not your shadow if they can help it. You once extended a handshake to a visiting noble. He bowed instead, deeply, reverently, while slowly backing away as if your palm might drip on his boots. There's a word for what you carry, not the waste, but the social marker, untouchability. In cities large enough to develop layers of hierarchy, people like you are necessary but not welcome. You are tolerated. You are essential, but you are not invited. The irony is that your presence is safer than most. You wash. You boil your rags. You change your shoes twice a day. The cobbler knows your soles by heart. The innkeeper knows to reserve the room nearest the bath. But perception beats logic, and that perception says you are filth. You've been given other names: Nightman, Gongmaster, Waste Warden. None of them sound kind. All of them sound necessary. The church won't denounce you, but it won't sit next to you either. The priest once asked if your pit was consecrated. You asked if he wanted to bless it. He didn't bring it up again. You've tried to engage socially. You brought honey to the midsummer feast. You left it on the table and stepped back. People eyed it like it was cursed. Later, someone used it to glue a chair leg. It held. You offered help with repairs. Your hands are strong, your arms practiced. But when you touched the ladder, they burned it. Not immediately. A week later, quietly. You saw the smoke and said nothing. There's a strange superstition that surrounds your role. Some believe you can see into people, that you know who they really are based on what they leave behind. They believe you hold secrets, confessions, curses. They think you can hex a man with a single whisper, or clear his sins by burning the right mixture of straw and herbs. You don't correct them. You've leaned into it once or twice, told someone their dream meant too much bile, told another their bad luck would pass after they skipped bread for 3 days. They believed you. You saw them eating beans and crying. Your words carry weight now, not because of wisdom. Because people assume anyone who deals with human waste must also deal with human truth. You're never invited to weddings, but you're always asked for advice beforehand. Can you bless the marriage bench? Can you ward off digestive mishaps during the ceremony? You once gave a couple a bundle of mint tied with string. They wore it on their belts. This ceremony went smoothly. You got a crust of pie and a nod. Children stare at you, not with malice, with wonder. They haven't learned yet what society tells them. To them, you're a wizard who controls a magical hole in the ground. You can make things disappear. You can make adults cry. You can tell if someone ate too much plum. One child called you Lord of the Flies. You gave him a coin. There are places you don't go. The town square during sermons. The front row at festivals. Anywhere with lace. You've made peace with it. You watch from the edges. You listen. You learn more from distance than most do from conversation. Because while everyone else forgets what they did after they leave your bench, you remember. You remember who visits too often, who never leaves anything behind, who insists on secrecy, who hums when nervous, who apologizes to the wood before sitting. You know the town better than anyone, and the town knows it. They won't say it aloud. They won't write it in a letter, but they glance toward you when things go wrong, when someone falls ill, when a storm comes early, when the river smells wrong. They ask if you've noticed anything. You always have. You just don't always share, because sometimes it's better to be feared than forgotten, and in this town you are both. By the later Middle Ages, the act of relieving oneself had become more than just a physical necessity. For many people, it had morphed into a ritualistic experience laced with superstition, pseudo-medicine, spiritual anxiety, and the desperate hope that what entered the latrine wouldn't take anything valuable with it on the way out. As the person in charge of medieval sanitation, you become intimately familiar not only with the bodily functions of your community, but also with its deepest irrational fears. In medieval Europe, waste was not merely filth. It was considered a direct reflection of your inner balance, both physical and spiritual. The prevailing medical theory of the day, Galenic medicine, imported through Arabic translations and endlessly debated by monastic scholars, taught that your body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Any irregularity in digestion, stool colour, consistency, or frequency could be interpreted as an imbalance in these humours. For that reason alone, excrement was both feared and monitored, not just by physicians but by average people who wanted to maintain a semblance of health in a world without microscopes. This paranoia translated directly into the latrine. You notice that some visitors come carrying sprigs of herbs, usually rosemary, sage, or mint. These aren't just for the smell. According to medieval herbals, the standard medical manuals of the time, rosemary was believed to protect against bad air or miasma, which was thought to carry disease. Sage was recommended in many texts to ward off fevers and digestive ills. Mint was associated with purification, and according to one 13th century remedy, could help prevent wicked vapours from entering the head. Whether these herbs did anything is irrelevant. They made people feel protected, and that placebo was often the strongest treatment available. A significant number of latrine goers leave behind charms or talismans. Some are carved from bone, others fashioned from bent pewter or bits of leather. One common design includes a small pouch of herbs tied with red thread, a traditional apotropaic element used to repel evil. Red thread in particular shows up frequently in European folk remedies and magical practices. In some cultures, it was believed to confuse demons, who would become trapped trying to follow the knotwork. You've also seen symbols scratched into the wooden benches, crude circles, crosses, or unfamiliar sigils. These are folk protections, likely passed down orally, meant to keep evil spirits from entering the body while it's vulnerable. It was widely believed that the act of relieving oneself opened both physical and spiritual channels. This made the latrine a liminal space, a dangerous threshold where your soul could be meddled with. Superstitions around latrines aren't exclusive to Europe, but in medieval Christendom they became entangled with religious belief. Some users cross themselves before sitting, others mutter short prayers, often invoking Saint Fiacre, ironically the patron saint of both hemorrhoids and gardeners, in hopes of a smooth passage. In rare cases, people recite parts of the Psalms, repurposed as protective invocations. The cultural anxiety wasn't always religious. Folk tradition suggested the devil himself could live in the latrine pit, particularly if it was deep, dark, and infrequently cleaned, which most of them were. This is one reason why many public or monastic latrines included a second hole in the wall, meant for airflow, but also assumed by some to help release demons so they wouldn't climb up. The idea of spirits entering through vulnerable parts of the body was widespread, and latrines offered prime access. Seasonal rituals also make appearances. During festivals or holy days, certain foods, heavily spiced meats, dried fruits, and thick porridge, were consumed in large quantities, leading to sudden gastrointestinal distress. Visitors during these times often carried extra tokens of protection, or followed stricter routines before using the latrine. This could include knocking 3 times on the door, walking around the bench clockwise, or lighting a bit of tallow before entering. All methods meant to ward off bad luck, evil spirits, or unfortunate accidents. Even the better educated weren't immune to these habits. Astrology played a significant role in medieval medicine, and certain constellations were believed to influence the body's excretory functions. The so-called zodiac man diagram found in countless medical manuscripts mapped astrological signs to body parts. If Mercury was in retrograde, or Saturn was dominant, A physician might advise postponing a bowel movement altogether. For the average person, this translated into avoiding the latrine on unlucky days, or offering a quick prayer to the heavens before sitting. These rituals were never officially codified. They weren't written down in laws or enforced by guilds, but they were followed, generation after generation, by people who didn't fully understand their own plumbing, biological or architectural. You, as the one maintaining this sacred but revolting space, become the silent witness to it all. You begin to recognize patterns. Certain families always leave behind the same charm. Certain visitors always enter with the same hand gesture. Some knock, some spit, some whistle. You don't judge. You sweep around the talismans. You leave the herbs undisturbed. You clean the carved symbols but never sand them away. Because even if you don't believe the devil lives in the pit, you've been doing this long enough to know one simple truth. People are far more afraid of what they can't see than what they can smell. And in the medieval world, the latrine sits right at the intersection of the seen and the unseen, the sacred and the grotesque, the physical and the imagined. A bench becomes an altar. A bundle of mint becomes a shield. A whispered prayer becomes the difference between daily routine and divine punishment. None of it makes your job easier, but it does make it more interesting. Now, as the festival season draws near and the townsfolk begin preparing for a week of overconsumption and regret, the charms will multiply, the smells will intensify, and the rituals will take on new urgency. Because when everything else in life is uncertain, people cling to the strangest routines, especially when hovering over a pit full of their own digestive reckoning. So the next time someone romanticizes the Middle Ages with talk of gallant knights and noble quests, just remember this. Someone, probably wearing mismatched shoes and holding a vinegar-soaked rag, had to unstick a mutton leg from a collapsing toilet bench while dodging airborne cheese chunks and prayers to Saint Fiacre. And that someone was you. Sweet dreams.